She gets her news from the New York Times, Google, and CNN. She said two things that really stuck out. One, quote, "I don't really have an opinion of Trump," and, quote, "No one is above the law." I'm not so sure about juror number 2.
Welcome to Earth 2, where that guy, his name's Jesse, thinks neither of those things are possible from any human living on Earth 2. Hi again, everybody. It's now 5 o'clock in New York. It turns out that was a critical legal turning point as well. Part of a chain reaction, if you will, of the cruelty and venom and recklessness that brought us to today. A crash course in actions and consequences for a man who so doggedly has avoided them his entire life. Today's first order of business in court in the criminal election interference and hush money trial was time set aside to consider whether Trump violated his gag order, the one that was imposed well before he shared a quote on social media from that guy from Fox News, insisting certain jurors were undercover liberal activists. During that hearing today, our NBC News colleagues there in the courtroom reported that Judge Merchan went so far as to raise his voice in frustration during his questioning of lawyers for Donald Trump, unwilling or unable to adequately defend his position that the Trump posts in question were political in nature and therefore outside the scope of the gag order altogether. Attorney Todd Blanche got an earful from Judge Merchan to the effect of, "I keep asking you the question over and over and I'm not getting an answer." It's according to our colleagues in the room. And this, quote, "Mr. Blanche, you're losing all credibility with this court." Prosecutors, meanwhile, while making the case that there's no straight-faced argument that the posts relate to anything other than the trial, they brought up the comments by that guy, Jesse Waters, pointing out that juror number 2 asked to be excused the day after that ran, not 12 hours after. It was, in their words, precisely what the gag order was intended to prevent. Bragg's team suggested that they are not yet seeking incarceration as a penalty for Trump, although they added this: the defendant seems to be angling for that. Indeed, after the gag order hearing was through, like right when it ended, Judge Merchan said he would reserve a decision on the matter. Trump was right back on his social media platform attacking the judge, likening the proceedings to a kangaroo court. As Bragg's team noted, Trump, quote, "knows exactly what he's doing." Before court adjourned today, a short time ago, the focus was on David Pecker, former CEO of American Media, which owns the National Enquirer. As we mentioned earlier in the broadcast, he's an alleged co-conspirator. The other end of that mutually beneficial relationship with Donald Trump, a lucrative one, trafficking in scoops to publish, or crucially to not publish. Pecker was right there at the beginning of Trump's plan to keep his relationship with Stormy Daniels a secret, hidden from the American people ahead of the election. Of course, the cover-up failed on a long road that led us to this day, with the disgraced ex-president forced to sit and listen to Pecker testify about it in front of a jury that could potentially decide he's guilty. As we said, action, consequences. It's where we start the hour with some of our most favorite reporters and friends. Back this hour with another great table, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. She was in the courthouse for us today. And the host of the On Brand podcast, Donny Deutsch, is here. NBC's Vaughn Hilliard was not permitted to leave in the break, so he is still with us. Lisa Rubin, take me inside the day.
Nicole, I think one of the things that was most stunning about the gag order argument is the way that Trump not only quoted Jesse Waters, but then fed Jesse Waters. So one of the things that came out today is one of the posts that's offensive, according to the DA's office, is that Jesse Waters quote that you just played. But what Trump wrote is they're catching undercover liberal activists lying to the judge just to get on the jury. The just to get on the jury part, Chris Conroy of the DA's office told Judge Merchan today, that wasn't anything that Jesse Waters said until 8 o'clock that evening. The tweet or the post was at 5 p.m. that afternoon. It fully illustrates the feedback mechanism between Trump and conservative media. Waters says something, Trump then takes it, adds his own words to it, attributes it back to Jesse Waters. And then what does Jesse Waters do 3 days later? 3 hours later? He repeats the whole thing verbatim. And so I thought what was really interesting about it was that they were showing how these actions have consequences by how they get amplified and perverted. He takes an idea, he turns it into his own. It goes right back out into that same ecosystem to endanger the people who are participating in this process.
Well, and it's important to point out, too, that this was the juror, I believe, juror number 2, that Judge Merchan said would have been a great juror or good juror. I mean, there is a known consequence to the actions of Jesse Waters and Donald Trump.
There is. And one of the things that they mentioned today, the DA's office, was, look, a number of these posts that we're talking about today, they're not about the jury. They're about Michael Cohen or about Stormy Daniels. But they infect the entire process to the extent that they chill participation in the administration of justice. They threaten the integrity of these proceedings. That impacts all of us, and maybe most especially the jurors who are already afraid of what this means for them, because you've already seen one of them excuse herself, other potential jurors break down on the stand, basically saying, I can't do this. And then another juror yesterday asking for a sidebar because of the pressure that that person was increasingly feeling.
Trump is often covered, like a 4-cell amoeba, that just can't control himself. There was a suggestion from the prosecutors that he's doing it on purpose. What's your sense?
I think there's an element of that. I think it's a both and, right?
Trump, he is a 4-cell amoeba and he can't control himself?
I would say he is a person who is inherently impulsive, and yet there's some element of strategy there. Like when I think about how he's comported himself in the courtroom, when I've seen him, when he walks down the aisle, that is absolutely self-directed, very clear to pause and look down the aisle of everybody assembled. And yet, this is also a person who is closing their eyes, whether they're doing that to prevent themselves from having a temper tantrum, whether he genuinely is tired when he's at rest, is not entirely clear to me. So I think it's a both-and situation.
Donnie, we'll deal with the pecker of it all.
Can I just first say, yuck?
Yeah.
Just yuck. I've been listening
Which
to your
part
show
of it? All of it?
All of it.
Yeah.
Just, you get so close to it, you get caught up in the details. Just what a sleazy, greasy, low-life universe this is. Even whether you start with Trump and you go to Pecker and you go to Jesse Waters, it's just yuck. And I think the net take, I don't think viewers or people who are tuning in or kind of tuning in are going to take away every one of these nuances. But there is such a yuck factor there that if you forgot about Donald Trump, is the net of this. And I think there's an exhaustion plus yuck that people just go, oh, do I want more of this? And I think a lot of people have minimized this trial because it is not election interference, it is not insurrection, it is not classified documents. It is a reminder of yuck.
Well, I mean, to your point, there also may be people that don't, there's no camera in the courtroom, there's no audio, so you have to be watching the coverage of the trial to know what's happening. But no one's with him. There are no humans with him. He's got two living, he's got a wife and an ex-wife, he's got kids from all of his marriages, none of them are there.
And I don't know if I agree with Lisa that you give him, I think, a little too much credit, that he's walking down the aisle. I think he is just one of these guys that is just in the moment, it's his own universe. There's nobody that exists beyond him. And he's sleeping, he's talking, he's passing gas, whatever he's doing. I don't think that there's this great master internal puppeteer going on. I think he's lost that, if you will.
Well, and we won't amplify his tweets, but he's like lying at the rate the rest of us are breathing.
Right. And I think that let's stop. I mean, I'm sure it's frustrating for a criminal defendant to every day to have to go through this process, right? This person is contending that they are innocent, that they should have never been charged in the first place, that this case is a hoax, right? That's the Donald Trump position here. And yet at the same time, just in the last 10 minutes, he put out a new social media post, which we're having a conversation about a trial about whether Donald Trump has lied or not. And he just, can I just read the first line?
Yeah.
Thousands of people were turned away from the courthouse in Lower Manhattan by steel stanchions and police, literally blocks from the tiny side door from where I enter and leave. It is an armed camp to keep people away. I read that because I was down there, Lisa was down there, and that is the furthest thing from the truth. That's a lie. It's not real life. There was less than 10 people there to support Donald Trump today. And anybody across the country, you can fly to LaGuardia, JFK, or Newark. You can take the train in, come to Lower Manhattan, 100 Center Street, and you can literally walk on the sidewalk where the front door of that courthouse is. There are not thousands of pro-Trump demonstrators that are there, but his 6.6 million followers on Trump Truth Social, they will be saying that, and that is a difficult reality. So Donald Trump wants to argue via his lawyer inside that he's not a liar, but on the outside, he's putting out posts that are just not even comprehensible.
I mean, and I guess what's laughable, I mean, you know, there's nothing laughable about the criminal justice system. As a criminal defendant, he has a presumption of innocence. That's what the judge keeps making clear. What's laughable is that the sliming and the smearing of the process, where usually there's a moment where everything gets real, he's immune to all of that. There's no respect for the judge. There's no respect for the jurors. And I wonder if anyone has the standing with him to say this isn't going to help you.
I don't think that that is the campaign operation that is currently around him. Donald Trump largely speaks for himself now. And there were efforts through his 2016 campaign and while he was in the White House to try to moderate him, right, or try to reason with him. And yet what you saw was, right, in 2016, efforts to try to reach, mainstream news organizations, NBC News, New York Times, right, despite him being frustrated by them. Instead, he kept on with fake press, and it worked to a great extent. Americans' trust in mainstream news organization is corroded, right? There were folks that told him, don't tell people to not believe in their elections. You know, there was folks were there in 2020 on his campaign team and in the White House, right? Well, that didn't work. Donald Trump, though, as a result, has effectively corroded trust in our elections. Mm-hmm. And now with the justice system, it's effectually working now. Again, when I go back to repercussions, Donald Trump, right, outside of losing 2020, outside of now having criminal indictments and trials, largely has not seen for himself the repercussions. And for him, his best effort here is by continuing to try to erode trust in the justice system. And that means saying, I should not be inside of this courthouse.